You might be walking into your local gun store with total confidence, only to discover later that it's flagged on a secret government list. That might sound far-fetched, but it's exactly what happened when certain federal authorities quietly leaked details identifying shops that sold firearms later traced to crime scenes. These weren't shady, fly-by-night operations either. Many were large, reputable dealers who followed every federal and state regulation to the letter. Yet they were still named and shamed as if they were complicit in criminal activity. In this video, we'll talk about how this leaked list, a list that surfaced not too long ago when Brandon was still POTUS, has become a tool for shaming lawful businesses, why that move was designed to undermine our Second Amendment rights, and how it can still impact every pro-2A American. Even though we admittedly have a more gun-friendly administration now, with a president who's publicly supported the right to keep and bear arms and an acting ATF director who supposedly stands on the side of lawful gun owners, the bureaucracy itself remains largely unchanged. We have Kash Patel in charge at the ATF, stepping in for Steve Dettelbach, who was anything but friendly to our rights. And yet, there's still lingering mistrust among gun owners. Why? Well, because an agency's culture doesn't evaporate overnight just because the top position changed. For every appointee who respects our freedoms, there are countless longtime employees who have become entrenched in the old ways of doing business. These are the same bureaucrats who spent years under anti-gun leadership, building habits and enforcing policies that often leaned more toward appeasing gun control activists than serving the Constitution. To make matters worse, there's a closet anti-2A in the mix. Attorney General Pam Bondi, whose stance on firearms has been unsurprisingly indifferent to actual Second Amendment concerns. You'd think someone Trump picked would lean strongly toward letting responsible citizens exercise their rights without government interference. Yet her approach has been lukewarm at best, with little interest in defending ordinary Americans when bureaucrats target them. When it comes time to rein in the agencies under her purview, she's either silent or signals that she's not going to rock the boat. That kind of passive leadership is dangerous, especially when we're dealing with an alphabet agency that has a history of overreach, inconsistent enforcement, and quietly caving to gun control pressure. The imbalance between supposedly pro-Second Amendment leadership at the highest levels and officials who apparently can't be bothered to protect our freedoms is frustrating. We can't truly trust the system. We're told that this administration has our back, but what we see on the ground tells a different story. Slow-walking deregulation, no serious internal reforms, and agencies still weaponized against lawful Americans. It's hard to have faith in leadership when the people enforcing the laws appear more loyal to the legacy of the previous administration than to the Constitution. The window dressing may have changed, but the machinery underneath still grinds in the same direction, and that direction isn't friendly to gun owners. The infamous secret list is a perfect example of how trust got eroded in the first place. Gun stores across the country were identified by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives if a certain number of traced guns led back to them. The problem is that a traced firearm doesn't necessarily prove any wrongdoing by the original shop. Straw purchasers could have lied on their forms, criminals might have stolen firearms post-sale, or the firearm could have passed through many hands before ending up at a crime scene. None of those scenarios reflect a deliberate act of negligence by the retail store. Yet anti-gun politicians and activists used those raw numbers to claim these stores were fueling crime. Their narrative was, if a store has multiple traced firearms, they must be bad actors. That portrayal served two purposes. It let these politicians sidestep holding actual criminals accountable, and it let them demonize any business that sells a constitutionally protected product. Meanwhile, honest FFL holders who comply with all the regulations ended up smeared for no valid reason. Instead of focusing on criminals who commit violent acts, certain lawmakers portrayed retailers and manufacturers as if they were the real culprits. At one point, there was a push under prior leadership to amplify this tactic into full-blown federal policy. We saw politicians champion legislative proposals that would label and blacklist certain manufacturers or dealers, potentially blocking them from federal contracts. They conveniently ignored the fact that these companies follow every rule on the books. Anyone who's purchased a firearm at a legitimate shop knows the drill. You fill out ATF Form 4473, pass a background check via the FBI NEX, and only then are you allowed to leave with your new purchase. That's how it works across the board, from the smallest gun store to the largest big-box sporting goods chain. When these facts get glossed over, It's usually because they don't serve the anti-gun narrative. It's easier to claim guns flood the streets from unscrupulous dealers than to acknowledge that criminals, by definition, rarely follow the law. If a firearm is stolen or passed around illegally, how is that the retailer's fault? It isn't, but the average citizen might not see the details behind each trace. And that's exactly what these political maneuvers rely on, a lack of information that allows sensational headlines to drive public opinion. What do you think about these attempts to paint lawful businesses as accessories to crime? Do you believe these efforts serve any legitimate purpose, or are they nothing more than a ploy to demonize our entire community? Let me know in the comments below, because I'm interested in hearing how other pro-2A folks interpret this long-running blame game. An especially galling example of misdirected blame came from a piece of legislation that aimed to tie federal contracts to the so-called bad apple classification. Under that proposal, if guns traced to a certain manufacturer or dealer showed up in multiple crimes, the U.S. Attorney General could effectively blacklist those companies from doing business with federal agencies. This measure was sold to the public as a way to curb violence, yet it would never actually keep weapons out of the hands of criminals. What it would do is severely penalize companies that supply firearms to law enforcement and the military, entities that rely on high-quality equipment to keep citizens safe. When we see measures like that, it's hard not to question if some of these lawmakers even grasp the basics of how gun transactions work, or if they simply don't care. Pushing an agenda that punishes people for complying with the law while ignoring the actual criminals who violate it is unfair. Many folks who draft these bills never set foot in a gun store or speak directly with firearm owners. They operate off talking points from gun control lobbyists, or they rely on misleading data that lumps together entirely different kinds of gun-related incidents. Meanwhile, we have an administration that's supposedly more favorable to the Second Amendment now, which might make it tempting to think all is well. But the memory of these lists, leaks, and name-and-shame campaigns hasn't vanished. It lingers, partly because the gears of bureaucracy churn at their own pace, and partly because not everyone in our current federal structure is genuinely pro-2A. Kash Patel might be pro-2A at the helm of the ATF, but he's surrounded by career officials who were quite comfortable under previous directors. And then there's Pam Bondi, who identifies as a conservative but doesn't actually care about the constitutional rights of everyday citizens trying to exercise their freedom to keep and bear arms. It's not just about who's in the Oval Office. It's also about the massive infrastructure of federal employees who set day-to-day policy. That's a key reason so many people say the ATF itself can't be trusted. We've witnessed Operation Fast and Furious, which resulted in thousands of firearms being lost across the border and even contributed to the death of a U.S. Border Patrol agent. We've also seen contradictory enforcement patterns, going after small-time pawn shops on minor clerical errors while ignoring bigger issues. And, of course, we've seen how easily the agency flips on interpretations of regulations, sometimes criminalizing items they previously deemed legal. For many gun owners, it feels like the ATF is never truly on their side, even when a more supportive administration is in place. One might assume that an individual like Pam Bondi, who openly proclaims conservative values, would be an ally for personal freedom. Yet time and again, her actions or inactions haven't aligned with any robust defense of the right to self-defense. In practice, her stance has been lukewarm, and lukewarm defense of a core constitutional right is hardly any defense at all. The lesson here is that labels, MAGA, conservative, don't automatically guarantee unwavering support. If you're a patriotic American who wants to preserve the Second Amendment, you've got to watch for actions, not just words. There's another angle to this: the TART Amendment. This provision was designed to keep trace data confidential so it wouldn't be exploited for political attacks. The idea was to allow law enforcement agencies to share data with each other for legitimate investigations, without enabling politicians or activist organizations to cherry-pick numbers and falsely accuse retailers. Yet the push to publish that data for transparency became a smokescreen for vilifying the gun industry. We know that someone might see 100 guns traced back to store X and assume that store is complicit in illegal activity, without realizing that the store likely sold thousands or tens of thousands of firearms legally. It doesn't help that we've had glaring instances of the federal government failing to secure its own arms. We've watched billions of dollars worth of military gear end up in hostile hands overseas. We've seen fiascos like Operation Fast and Furious. But ask the same politicians who wave these store trace lists around if they plan on taking accountability for those failures, and you'll usually get silence or deflection. Apparently, it's easier to shame legitimate businesses on mainstream news than to admit to catastrophic oversights at the highest levels of governance. Despite all of this, hope isn't lost. Many patriotic Americans have become much more engaged, speaking up when government agencies overreach. Gun owners network through local clubs, online forums, and national associations to share information about proposed legislation, pending court cases, and tips on lawful ownership. If there's a silver lining to these misguided name and shame efforts, it's that more people are waking up to the reality that every freedom requires vigilance. Even if the top leadership in an agency or administration claims to back our rights, if the staff beneath them is loyal to an older agenda, we could see more leaks or lists aimed at painting gun owners and sellers in a negative light. That vigilance also means pushing back when we see flawed data or half-baked legislation. It's crucial to remind fellow Americans that a trace number alone doesn't mean a gun shop is doing anything wrong. It's just a data point indicating that at some time after purchase, a firearm was used in a crime or ended up in a police inquiry. With millions of guns sold in this country each year, it's inevitable that some firearms from perfectly lawful transactions will eventually be misused, lost, or stolen. Punishing the retailers for that misfortune accomplishes nothing except undermining a lawful industry and sidestepping the culpability of actual criminals. I don't know about you, but I see this pattern as a dangerous attempt to erode our rights under the guise of cracking down on crime. The blame ought to land squarely on those who commit unlawful acts, not on the men and women providing a service that's enshrined in our founding principles. But what do you think? Comment below, and please like, share, subscribe, and click on the bell icon for more of these videos. Thanks for watching.